Our second reading is from the Hebrew Scriptures. It's taken from the book of Isaiah, chapter 6 and verses 1 through 4 and 8 through 11. It continues this theme of justice, which is prevalent today. Listen for what the Spirit might speak into your life today in this reading from the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. God has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, to display God's glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. I will faithfully give them their recompense, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them. Their descendants shall be known among the nations, and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them shall acknowledge that they are a people whom the Lord has blessed. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My whole being shall exult in my God. For God has clothed me with garments of salvation. God has covered me with a robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom bedecks himself with a garland, as a bride adorns herself with jewels. For as the earth brings forth its shoots, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to spring up, so the Lord will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before all nations. May God bless to our understanding this reading from God's holy word, and to God's name be glory and praise. I, the Lord, love justice. Justice. In Advent? Why justice? It's Joy Sunday. Justice is a word that we hear a lot in this church because we don't see justice necessarily as heaven and hell and the afterlife. It's the way God's favor flows to all people in this world, in this life, and how our favor should flow to all people too, especially those disadvantaged by society. But now I've got a conundrum. Preaching about justice on Joy Sunday, this is the old Advent dissonance. It's a whole season set aside for longing and for yearning and for waiting for a world that ought to be, but is not yet. It's a season for singing those minor key hymns that all of you complain about. It's a season to burn candles against the gathering dark of December and to hold that light up into the dark and say, we hope. We hope. What kind of preacherly acrobatics is it going to take to make joy and justice to be about the same thing on this Joy Sunday? Because justice actually is our topic in confirmation class today. There's got to be a connection. Maybe justice is more than just punishing the guilty. Maybe a truly just world is one in which each person is free to find their life's joy and to pursue it. Justice is that coming kingdom where we're all free to live not for the rules, not for the appearances, not for material gain, not for power, not for the admiration of others, but for the simple joy that keeps us going. What if the powerful of this world lived for their joys and not for the false pursuit of joy through power and money and fame? God grant us a just world where people do not merely chase their own directions in pursuit of happiness, but where all are enabled to find their deepest joys. So a member of this congregation recommended to me that I should read the old novel All Quiet on the Western Front. Actually, I was hoping to have it written in time for Peace Sunday. That didn't happen, because it is a war novel. It's a novel about World War I, written by a German veteran of that war. It was published in 1928, and it was translated from German, and so I didn't have much hope going into this book. And I'm not much of a fan of war literature anyway. But it had me. From the very first page until the last heartbreaking sentence, it had me. World War I was especially brutal, you probably know. They had the trench warfare, and they hadn't had the Geneva Conventions yet. And so there was chemical warfare, and they were using things like flamethrowers. It was really, really brutal. And the novel speaks of all of this stuff in sickening detail. It's not for a squeamish reader, if that's who you are. But more powerfully, it speaks from the mind and the heart of a simple German boy, a soldier who went to war and sees the war from his own perspective. He has no interest in it. He's not exactly sure why there is a war. He just knows that he had a very inspiring teacher in high school who said the greatest honor of a man's life is to lay down his life for his country. The greatest privilege that you have is to give your life for the fatherland. And most of the boys in the class were inspired, and they went off and enlisted. They joined the war. But after a few years in the trenches and living in constant fear and never getting enough to eat and seeing their friends dying and participating in the horrors of systemic killing, Paul just doesn't know who he is anymore. He just wants to go home. He just wants to find a nice girl. He wants to read books. He loves books. Paul does indeed get to go home on leave for 2 weeks, but it's not good. People back there don't get him anymore, and they ask him questions that he doesn't want to talk about. He doesn't want to talk about the war. And once home, he realizes that he doesn't belong there anymore either. And it feels like the only place he does belong is on the front lines, the place that he hates the most in all the world. And now this story is especially dark. I will try to tell it with tact. On the front lines in a ditch, he does end up killing another soldier, a Frenchman. And then he lays there trapped in that ditch, unable to escape because of the bullets whizzing over his head. And he looks at the other man and thinks, this was not my enemy. In fact, under normal circumstances, this could have been my friend. Why isn't this guy my friend? Somebody in a far-off room far from the war, sipping bourbon and signing papers, decided that he and I were enemies. The actual enemy is not him. He's a guy just like me who got pulled into history. The actual enemy are those guys sipping their bourbon in far-off rooms, deciding that all of us right out of high school needed to go off and give our lives for their egos. He has a radical thought. And then he says, let them fight if they want to fight. Let those guys take up their weapons and fight each other, instead of drawing us into their squabbles and wrecking the world besides. I've got a life to live. I wasn't made to give my life to this war that I don't know anything about, nor was this Frenchman. I was made for summer mornings in the sun. I was made for the ripple of light on the water. I was made to take my kids to the beach in the summer. I was made to teach them patience and kindness. I was made for the love of a spouse, maybe even for grandchildren. He sees the injustice of it all. He was made for joy, and he vows to spend his civilian life after the war shedding light on the injustice of war. And of course, he never gets the opportunity. He finally gets hit by a random bullet just a few days before the peace treaty is signed on a relatively calm day where the army report says all quiet on the Western Front. So the Nazis banned this book when they came into power. They said it was unpatriotic. In fact, that's how I came across the book. It was on the banned book table at a bookstore. And isn't this just exactly the kind of book that does get banned? A book that lifts a mirror to society's face and says, look, this is who you are. Look how your unjust systems crush so many. That's the kind of book that gets banned, declaring that the emperor has no clothes. Declaring, like this book does, that every human life should have an opportunity for joy, to find its joy, to embrace its joy, to pursue its joy. And that those things that prevent us from discovering and living into our joy are an injustice. Find for us in a just society, all persons will be pointed toward their joy and equipped to reach it. And then this reading from the book of Isaiah. God sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners. I, the Lord, love justice. You get a gold star if you recognize these words as the ones that Jesus used later in the book of Luke to kick off his public ministry. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I hope many of you recognized them. And if God sends Jesus to speak blessing to the oppressed and to speak healing to the brokenhearted and to liberate the captive and the prisoner, then it is our task in this world as well. In other words, it is not good news unless it's good news to the oppressed and to the poor. It is not the gospel if it does not heal broken hearts and lives and minds. It is not the gospel if it does not free people from the places where they get stuck. For the gospel of Jesus Christ is about joy, finding it, embracing it, living into it. And anything in our hearts and homes or societies that crushes our joy is an injustice. But what is joy, and why should everybody have a right to it? Every living thing. Joy is not thrills, it's not merriment, it's not good times necessarily, though hopefully it will include some of those things. Joy is God's own life overflowing into us in creativity and in freedom. I remember my grandfather used to come home every weekday from his job at the brickyard, bone-tired. He would get a bath because my grandparents didn't even have a shower in their house. They had to take baths. And as soon as he was done with his bath, he would change his clothes and he would go into the basement and he would work at his wood carving bench, where he produced the ugliest furniture you have ever seen. And he made wooden toys that were impossible to play with. And everything he made at that wood shop broke very easily. But it was his joy. It was his way of asserting his identity as a woodworker, as a creative person, over against a job that he hated and that he spent most of his life doing. He was claiming his joy by making terrible furniture. Our joy is usually linked to our skills, to our creativity as individuals. What is joyful to me might not be joyful to you. In fact, I'm pretty sure that you would find it kind of boring. Joy is that deepest of pleasures which has no victim and does no harm. It makes us feel as if we're doing what life is about, at least our lives. Joy is simple delight in the moment at hand. It's that happiness so keen that it opens your heart to the possibility of other happinesses. Because the presence of joy in one area of your life makes you to realize that there can be joy elsewhere in other areas. For once joy has drawn back the curtain of the soul, it shows you that there's more to living than drudgery, that there's a hidden depth, a richness, a wonder to being alive, a sacredness that we too often miss. Joy is its own thing. Joy opens new vistas out onto the otherwise hidden sacredness of our own lives. It speaks the truth that despite all sadness and all pain, there is also beauty. There's also meaning. There's the simple delight of ear and nose and eye and tongue and touch. There's joy. Simple joy. And wherever there is joy, God is there. What gives you joy? What is your joy? How much time are you spending on it? Do you pursue it? Whatever doubts you have about God, whatever mixed feelings you have about yourself, know this: God takes joy in you and creates you for a life of joy. That French priest and scientist and mystic Teilhard de Chardin said this, and I quote it: every Joy Sunday, once a year, always on the third Sunday in Advent, he says, joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God. Joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God. To take away a person's joy or to prevent any person from practicing their joy is a form of injustice, for it thwarts God's intentions and God's presence in that person's life. Our attempts at justice need to do more than just punish the guilty. Real justice would create a society where everyone can reach their potential and find their life's deep joys. It is an injustice to deprive any of their God-given joys, so long as those joys are innocent, which we kind of tried to establish joy always is. And so what does it mean? This Christmas time, 2023, what does all of this mean to you and to me? It means that it is not enough just to punish the guilty. A just society will find ways to help individuals live into the things that bring for joy, that make for joy. Libraries, public art, parks, paid vacation, shorter work weeks, more family leave, more free time, perhaps. Good and affordable health care, good and free education, mental health services, opportunities for all, an end to hate, and as much as possible, an end to war itself. For what else does peace on earth mean? A just society will have joy and individual flourishing built into the very system. Now, of course, misguided souls will always expect to find joy in all the wrong things, and they'll make the world the worse for it. They'll search for joy in power and in violence and in gain. It also means that we act unjustly whenever and wherever we prevent or harm someone's joy, including our own. You know, I used to be one of those sticklers for not putting the tree up until Advent. And if you put your tree up in November, though sometimes Advent begins in November. I was a stickler for not putting the tree up until Advent, and I might make you feel bad about it if you put your tree up sometime in November. Since then, I have begun to realize if that tree gives you joy, it's not my place to rob you of that joy. And if you want to put up your tree the day after Halloween, I will grit my teeth, but I won't say a word, because that's your joy. The tree gives you joy, and it's not my place to squash your joy. And in the spirit of supporting the joy of others, I have stopped complaining about that. I, the Lord, love justice, it says in Isaiah. Good news to the oppressed, binding up the brokenhearted, deliverance to the captive and the prisoner. Anything that deprives a living creature from flourishing is an injustice. Now, I know that comes into a gray area of whether to eat veal and whether to swat flies. That's between you and your conscience. I'm not going to help you there. But you are created for joy. You are created for joy, and everyone you meet is created for joy. Justice is about letting you have your joy and you letting them have theirs. How can we make that happen in this world? How can we make it happen? Amen.